It was a cold October night, and my wife Laura and I were at home on our small farm in rural Minnesota. We've lived here for years, surrounded by fields and woods, with our nearest neighbors about a mile away. It's peaceful, quiet, and usually uneventful. That night, we had just finished dinner and were relaxing in the living room, watching an old movie. The wind outside was howling, and the occasional creak of the house settling added to the eerie atmosphere. Around 10:30, just as we were getting ready to head to bed, there was a knock at the front door. It startled both of us because no one ever comes by this late, especially unannounced. Laura looked at me, her face already showing concern. I muted the TV and listened. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up and walked to the door, but Laura grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't open it." I nodded and instead called out, "Who's there?" A man's voice responded, "Please, I need help. My car broke down." The voice sounded shaky, almost desperate, but something about it felt off. I asked, "Where's your car?" There was a pause before he answered, "Just down the road. Please, can I come in and use your phone?" I hesitated. We don't get much traffic on our road, and it seems strange that someone would be out here this late. I told him, "Wait there," and went to grab my phone. Laura was already on edge, whispering that we should call the police. I told her to hold on as I returned to the door. "What's your name?" I asked through the door. The man hesitated again before saying, "Mike." Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. It didn't sound natural, like he was making it up on the spot. I told him, "I'll call someone for you, just wait there." But instead of thanking me, the man's tone changed. "No, I need to come inside," he said, his voice firmer now. Laura, who had been standing behind me, whispered, "Call the police now." I nodded and stepped away from the door, dialing 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, there was another knock, harder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps on the porch. Laura and I froze as we heard the footsteps move to the side of the house. Our living room has a large window that looks out onto the porch, and we had the curtains drawn. Suddenly, we heard the sound of someone trying to jiggle the window. Laura gasped, and I yelled, "Get away from here! I have a gun!" The noise stopped for a moment, and then we heard more footsteps. This time it sounded like there were two people. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that an officer was on the way, but out here, that could take a while. I ran upstairs to grab my shotgun while Laura stayed on the phone. As I came back down, we heard a loud bang at the back door, like someone was trying to force it open. I shouted again, "I'm armed!" "Leave now." The banging stopped, and everything went quiet for a moment. Then we heard a voice from the front porch again. "We just need to use your phone," it said. But this time, it was a different voice, deeper, more menacing. Laura was trembling, clutching her phone as she whispered to the dispatcher. I stood by the stairs, shotgun in hand, waiting for any sign of movement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights approaching the house. The sound of a car pulling up must have scared them off because we heard hurried footsteps running away into the night. When the officer arrived, he searched the property but didn't find anyone. He told us it was likely someone trying to break in, possibly thinking the house was empty. He advised us to install cameras and better locks, which we did the very next day. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened that door. The thought of it sends chills down my spine. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, all that separates you from the outside world is a thin wooden door. It was the summer of 2020, and I was staying at my uncle's cabin deep in the woods. He had asked me to house sit for a few days while he went on a fishing trip with some friends. The cabin was old but cozy, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was peaceful during the day, but at night, the isolation felt suffocating. On the second night, I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like something moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a deer, but the sound didn't stop. It was a steady rustling, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing, but then I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off the lights in the living room and peeked out the window, but it was pitch black outside. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight my uncle kept by the door and hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. The air was cold, and the forest was eerily silent. I shone the flashlight around the yard, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, this time coming from the direction of the shed at the edge of the property. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. There was no response, just the sound of something moving near the shed. I slowly made my way toward it, gripping the flashlight tightly. The shed door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I pushed it open with my foot and shone the light inside. The shed was empty, but the smell of something rotten hit me like a wave. I gagged and stepped back, covering my nose. That's when I noticed something on the ground just outside the shed. It was a small pile of animal bones, arranged in a strange circular pattern. My stomach turned and I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to get back to the cabin. As I turned to leave, I heard a low, guttural laugh coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but I couldn't see anyone. The laugh came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of branches snapping. I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. I tried the landline, but it was dead too. I sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, and waited. Hours passed, and I didn't hear anything else. I started to think maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe some pranksters messing with me. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard a soft tapping on the window behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head and saw a face staring back at me through the glass. It was pale and expressionless, with hollow black eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the knife. When I looked again, the face was gone. I ran upstairs to the bedroom and locked the door, barricading it with a chair. I sat in the corner, shaking and trying to stay quiet. That's when I heard the front door creak open. Footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were inside. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps moved through the house. They stopped right outside the bedroom door. I could see the shadow of feet under the doorframe. Then, the doorknob started to turn. I screamed, grabbing a lamp and preparing to defend myself. But just as the door started to open, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps retreated, and I heard the front door slam shut. I stayed frozen in place until the police arrived. They searched the property, but didn't find anyone. The only thing they found was the pile of bones outside the shed and strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. I left the next morning and never went back. My uncle installed cameras and motion sensors all over the property, but he never saw anything unusual. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there that night. All I know is that I'll never stay in that cabin again. My name is Daniel. I'm 24 years old, and I live in a small house on the edge of my grandparents' property in rural Tennessee. They're getting older, so I help them out with the land whenever I can. It's not a big farm, just a few acres of crops and a barn with some chickens and goats. My grandparents have always talked about how peaceful it is out here, but honestly, I've never felt that way. It's too quiet, too isolated. And after what happened last fall, I don't think I'll ever feel safe here again. It was late October, and my grandparents had gone to visit my aunt for a few days. I was left in charge of the property, which wasn't a big deal. I'd done it before. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time watching TV, playing video games, and checking on the animals. But on the third night, something happened that I still can't explain. It started around 10 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a loud thud outside. It sounded like it came from the barn. At first, I thought it might be one of the goats knocking something over, but then I heard it again, this time louder, like something heavy had fallen. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to check. The air was cold, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. As I approached the barn, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. That was strange because I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. Everything looked normal at first. The goats were huddled in the corner and the chickens were roosting. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the hay bales had been moved, and there were muddy footprints leading from the door to the back of the barn. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice echoed in the empty space, but there was no response. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the sound of the animals shifting nervously. I decided to lock the barn and head back to the house. If someone was out there, I didn't want to confront them alone in the dark. Back inside, I locked all the doors and windows and grabbed the shotgun my grandfather kept in the closet. I wasn't planning to use it, but having it made me feel a little safer. I sat in the living room, trying to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a drifter passing through or a prank by some local kids. But then, around midnight, the motion sensor light outside the back door turned on. I froze, staring at the door. The light illuminated the yard, but I couldn't see anyone. I waited, heart pounding, and then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I stood up, gripping the shotgun, and moved toward the window. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the edge of the yard. I turned off the lights inside the house so I could see better outside. The figure was standing just beyond the reach of the motion sensor light, barely visible in the shadows. They were tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were staring directly at the house. I shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" But they didn't respond. Instead, they took a step closer, just enough to trigger the light again. That's when I saw it. The person was holding something in their hand. It looked like a knife. My blood ran cold. I raised the shotgun and shouted again, "Get off my property or I'll shoot." The figure didn't move for a moment, and then, without a word, they turned and walked toward the woods at the edge of the property. I stayed up the rest of the night, shotgun in hand, but they didn't come back. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud leading from the barn to the house. Whoever it was had been watching me for a while. I called my grandparents and told them what happened. They were shaken but said it was probably just some drifter looking for trouble. I'm not so sure. Something about the way that person moved, the way they just stood there watching, it didn't feel random. I still live on the property, but I don't go outside at night anymore. And every time I hear a noise in the dark, I can't help but wonder if they're out there, waiting.